It was the kind of Kentucky summer that didn't just touch your skin, it claimed it. In Ashland, the July heat wrapped around you like a damp blanket, thick with honeysuckle and the faint iron breath drifting off the Ohio River. The air shimmered above the roads, insects droned like they were sawing the hours in half, and the whole town seemed to move slower, like it was wading through molasses. But for four boys, that summer didn't feel slow at all. It felt like it was slipping away. 13-year-old Tommy Hensley, fearless, fast-talking, always the first one to suggest a bad idea, spent most mornings pedaling across town before anyone else was awake. 12-year-old Jake Porter, quieter but loyal enough to follow Tommy anywhere, was usually waiting for him on the curb outside his house. Mark Dalton, sturdy and even-tempered, rounded out the trio. And then there was Ricky Cole, the youngest at 11, a kid who'd follow the older boys with that permanent grin of his, like he couldn't believe he'd been invited at all. Everyone in Ashland said those four were inseparable. Some kids grew apart over the years. Some rotated in and out of new friend groups. But not them. They were a single unit, moving through the neighborhood on bikes that rattled like coins in a jar. But that summer, the summer of 1987, felt different from the start. Tommy's dad had been laid off from the AK steel plant. The family was moving to Lexington by fall. Mark's dad had found new work across the river in Ohio. Even at their age, the boys knew what that meant. This was their last season together. Last time exploring the woods behind Black Run Creek. Last time competing to see who could ride the farthest without hands. Last time daring each other to climb the fire tower trail, even though every parent told them not to. One last summer. One last adventure. On the morning of July 23rd, neighbors remembered seeing the four of them gathered in front of Tommy's house. They were packing like explorers preparing for a quest. A handful of snack cakes, a rolled-up windbreaker, a cheap flashlight that barely worked, and a compass someone had stolen out of a tackle box. They didn't tell their parents exactly where they were going. They rarely did. By noon, the boys were seen pedaling in a tight line down Route 3, sweat beading on their necks. A delivery driver said they looked determined, like kids who had a destination in mind and a secret they were proud of. The last confirmed sighting came around 5 p.m. A man walking his golden retriever near the trailhead of the old Colton fire tower saw them coasting toward the woods. They waved, he waved back. One of those tiny, forgettable moments that only becomes unforgettable when everything after it goes wrong. When night fell and the boys weren't home, no one panicked. Not at first. They'd all camped near the creek before. Tommy especially had a reputation for staying out past dark and accepting whatever punishment came afterwards. But by midnight, the tone shifted. Porch lights snapped on one by one across the blocks. Fathers got into trucks. Mothers stood at windows with their arms wrapped tightly across their stomachs, like they were holding themselves together. People began checking back roads, hollering the boys' names into the dark. By 2 a.m., the Hensleys called the sheriff. And by the first stroke of sunrise, the search had already begun. Ashland wasn't a big place, but the woods behind the ridge, those were endless. The forest seemed to swallow sound, to swallow distance, to swallow anything that got too close. Deputies spread out along deer paths and game trails the boys were known to ride. Volunteers sloshed through mud up to their ankles. A helicopter circled low enough to rustle the treetops. For a moment, people believed they'd find something quickly. A bike, a dropped pack. Some sign that four boys had taken a wrong turn, but were close. Maybe scared, maybe hungry, but alive. Then the dogs found tracks. 4 sets of small footprints clustered together near the steep slope that fed into Black Run Creek. And then, nothing. The trail vanished in the mud, like it had been wiped clean. Search teams kept going. They combed ravines, swept the creek bed, called out until their voices cracked. The woods echoed with hundreds of footsteps and the constant hiss of radios. But not a single living sound answered back. By the end of the first week, exhaustion became something physical, something visible, etched into every face around the command post. Deputies looked hollow. Volunteers stopped talking. Mothers sat in folding chairs beside cold coffee, staring into the tree line as if willing their sons to walk out of it. The forest felt different now. Off. Wrong. A deputy named Harold Vickers, one of the most experienced members of the search, would later say it was like the woods were holding their breath. Some volunteers swore they heard laughter in the trees. Others said they caught glimpses of movement in the corner of their eye, shapes that vanished when they turned to look. Most blamed fatigue, others blamed fear. But everyone agreed on one thing. A place they'd considered safe for generations suddenly felt like it had teeth. On the 10th day, hope began to buckle under the weight of silence. Theories took over where facts ran thin. Maybe the boys had gotten lost. Maybe they wandered south into deeper woods. Maybe someone had seen them. Maybe someone had taken them. Rumors slid through Ashland's streets like shadows. Quiet, persistent, hard to ignore. But none of the rumors mattered as much as the truth no one wanted to say out loud. 4 boys had gone into the woods. And the woods gave nothing back. By the end of August, the official search was suspended. The posters taped to gas pumps began to fade. The volunteers went home. Reporters packed their vans, but the families stayed. Because parents don't stop searching. Not when the world tells them to, not even when the woods do. At dawn on the 11th day, Ashland woke to a sky the color of bruised steel. Humidity pressed low against the ground, coating grass blades and truck windshields with a thin film of sweat. The search camp, once busy enough to resemble a small festival, fell into a quieter rhythm. No chatter, no speculation. Just the resigned scrape of folding chairs and the tired shuffle of boots. The Boyd County Sheriff's Office tried to keep spirits up, but desperation has its own weight, and it seemed to settle on everything. The tents, the tables, the forest itself. People moved slower, as if the air resisted them. Deputy Harold Vickers, streaks of gray already starting to show in his beard, walked the perimeter of Black Run Creek for the 100th time. He was the kind of man who carried responsibility like a second skin, and losing 4 boys, 4 local boys, felt like failure written across his bones. Harold crouched by the creek bed. The water flowed thin but fast, the rocks slick and dark beneath the current. Somewhere up the ridge, a crow screeched. The sound echoed far longer than it should have. Behind him, someone called, "Harold, you need to see this." A volunteer, covered in briars and sweat, held something in his gloved hand. A torn strip of nylon. Mud-soaked, but unmistakably the kind used on old backpacks. A few yards away lay a rusted flashlight, half buried in leaves. It wasn't much, it wasn't proof of anything, but in that moment it felt like oxygen. Searchers surged back into the woods. Radios crackled, voices called out. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. But hope is a fragile thing, especially out there. By afternoon, the excitement dimmed. The items were bagged, labeled, and sent to Frankfurt for analysis. Maybe they were from the boys, maybe they weren't. In 1987, plenty of kids roamed these woods with gear that looked just like it. Still, that sliver of possibility was enough to drag the search deep into its second week. Meanwhile, tension began spreading through Ashland like wildfire. Parents kept their children indoors. Teenagers swapped theories behind the gas station on Carter Avenue. Reporters from Louisville and Cincinnati flooded the town, their vans parked in every available shoulder near the ridge. And rumors, dark, wild rumors, grew from whispers to something sharper. Some people blamed the landscape. Some blamed each other. Some blamed the unknown. There were stories about an old hermit living somewhere deep in the southern hills, a shut-in who only came into town once a month for supplies. Kids had used his name as a ghost story for years. Now adults were repeating it with lowered voices. Others whispered that maybe the boys hadn't gotten lost at all. Maybe they had been led somewhere. Maybe one of them had convinced the others to do something reckless. Maybe the truth wasn't as innocent as everyone wanted to believe. Fear bends logic, and Ashland was afraid. At the trailhead, the families camped out every night. The pain in their faces went beyond exhaustion. It was something brittle, something stretched so thin it might snap with the slightest touch. Linda Hensley, Tommy's mother, rarely spoke. She just walked the ridgeline for hours, calling his name softly like she didn't want to disturb the forest but had no choice. Jake's parents stopped pretending to be composed. His father paced until his boots tore at the seams. His mother cried silently into a handkerchief she never seemed to put away. Ricky's parents clung to each other, barely leaving their folding chairs. And Mark's older brother, already tall for 17, followed every deputy, every volunteer, offering to go deeper, farther, anywhere they would let him. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The Woods didn't want to give anything back. It was a Thursday when the weather broke. Clouds rolled in like bruises. Thunder crawled across the sky. By nightfall, rain hammered the forest with a violence that shook branches loose and churned the creek into a snarling brown torrent. For 2 days, the storm drowned everything in its path. Search grids washed clean, footprints disappeared, flags marking previous search zones were torn from the ground. Even the dogs refused to work, ears pressed back, whining at something unseen. When the storm finally moved east, the forest looked different, deeper, wilder, as if the rain had washed away the last traces of familiarity. That was the turning point. Morale broke. Even the most determined volunteers couldn't ignore the reality. If the boys had been out there, they wouldn't have survived this storm. Not without shelter, not without supplies, not after nearly 2 weeks. But families don't operate on logic. Families operate on love and fear and the smallest grain of hope. So the search continued, slowly, painfully, but continued. By the 19th day, the sheriff held a meeting behind the command tent. The families gathered, clutching each other. No news crew was allowed in, no crowd, just the parents, the deputies, and the truth. The sheriff's voice broke as he said it. They had exhausted every practical lead. The search would be scaled back. It wasn't abandonment. It was reality. A noise rose from the families that didn't sound human. It was grief made physical. It was the sound of hearts tearing in real time. Linda Hensley dropped to her knees. Jake's mother screamed a name that dissolved into sobs. Mark's brother punched the side of a truck hard enough to split skin. And little Ricky's father simply stared at the ground like the world had stopped spinning. That night, as the equipment was packed away, as volunteers hugged each other goodbye, as TV vans drifted toward the highway, Ashland transformed. The woods were no longer a playground. They were a wound, a ghost, a reminder. And though the official search ended, something else began, something quieter, lonelier, and far more enduring. Because Harold Vickers didn't stop. Even after the state pulled funding, even after the tents came down, even after most people forced themselves to move on, He kept going back. Back to the ridge, back to the creek, back to the places where dogs once barked and then fell silent. He didn't have proof, he didn't have hope, but he had a feeling, a pull, a weight in his chest that told him something had been missed, something no one had seen. Ashland dismissed him as a man who couldn't let go. But Harold wasn't trying to hold on to the past. He was trying to finish a story, one he believed wasn't over. Not yet. Time moved strangely in Ashland after the search ended. Weeks folded into months, and before anyone seemed ready for it, the summer of 1987 disappeared into memory, leaving behind a silence that settled over the town like dust. Parents grew more cautious. Kids who once spent their afternoons racing through the woods now stayed indoors, their bikes rusting in the yard. The fire tower trail, once a rite of passage, became forbidden, spoken about only in hushed tones, like the forest itself was listening. And through it all, a quiet ache lingered. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was something softer, something constant, like a bruise that never healed. The boys' families tried to keep life moving, but grief doesn't leave just because the world asks it to. Linda Hensley kept Tommy's room exactly as it was. The baseball cards on the dresser, the comic books stacked under the bed, the poster of Nolan Ryan taped to the wall. When the afternoon sun came through the window, she would sit on his bed and talk to him, whispering as if her voice might somehow reach wherever he was. Jake's parents left his bike leaning against the porch for months, then years. His father couldn't bring himself to move it. Sometimes he'd stand at the screen door at dusk, watching the driveway like he expected to see his son riding up it, laughing, hungry, apologizing for being late. Mark's family changed in quieter ways. His brother joined the military 2 years later and never returned to Ashland except for funerals. His parents sold their house and moved across the river to South Point, hoping a new town might mean a new start. But distance can't drown memory. And Ricky's family fell apart slowly. A separation, then a divorce. Their son's absence lingered in every room, a reminder of the life they once had. Everyone copes in different ways. Everyone breaks in different places. As the 90s crept in, Ashland changed. Restaurants opened, old businesses closed. Teenagers who'd once searched for the boys grew into adults with jobs and families of their own. The tragedy didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something people carried quietly. But Harold Vickers couldn't quiet it. Long after he retired from the sheriff's department, he kept returning to the ridges. He climbed slopes slick with moss. He traced waterlogged valleys where the boys might have walked. He studied old maps in his garage until his eyes blurred and his coffee went cold. His wife called his garage his other office. To Harold, it was more like a promise he hadn't yet fulfilled. On one wall hung a large map of the Daniel Boone National Forest boundary, covered in red tape and pencil marks. He circled areas that hadn't been searched properly. He pinned notes about unusual rock slides and old drainage paths. He cross-referenced weather reports from June and July of 1987. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing a truth that had slipped away before anyone knew it was missing. Harold believed the boys hadn't vanished near the fire tower at all. He was convinced they'd drifted farther south, farther than anyone had looked. The original maps hadn't been reliable. The storm had changed the terrain. And something about the way the dogs reacted near the gully all those years ago never sat right with him. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want attention. He wanted peace for the boys and maybe for himself. As the years became decades, stories about the disappearance twisted into local folklore. Teenagers dared each other to visit the Fire Tower Trail after dark. They claimed they heard giggles echoing from the ridge, or footsteps running alongside them in the brush. Others said they saw faint lights in the woods, like flashlights moving between trees with no hands to hold them. Most adults rolled their eyes, but even they avoided the trail after sunset. It's hard to ignore a story that left 4 empty chairs at 4 dinner tables.
By the early 2000s, the Colton Woods had been fenced off as part of a restricted wildlife area. The fire tower itself collapsed under the weight of rust and time, falling into the earth like a skeleton returning to its grave. Yet even as the forest reclaimed everything man made, people kept talking. Someone found old carved initials on a tree, maybe from the boys, maybe not. A pair of hikers claimed they stumbled onto a clearing that felt too deliberate to be natural, like someone had once tried to build shelter there. The stories never led anywhere concrete, but they kept the memory alive in their own strange way. Then, in 2008, something happened that felt almost unreal. A college student from Tennessee bought a box of abandoned police storage items at an online surplus auction. Inside it was a small, faded backpack, torn canvas, rusted zipper pull shaped like a star. At first, the buyer thought nothing of it, until they noticed 2 initials scratched faintly into the strap. T.H. They posted a picture online. A user from Kentucky recognized the evidence tag number from an old cold cases forum. Within days, the Boyd County Sheriff's Office had confirmed it. It was Tommy Hensley's backpack. The same backpack logged in evidence in 1987, the same one that had somehow gone missing from storage. The discovery lit Ashland up like a struck match. Reporters returned. Phones rang non-stop. Parents, older now, quieter now, felt the world tilt beneath them. After 2 decades of silence, could the Woods finally be giving up their secret? The backpack was sent to the state lab. Soil samples were collected. Fibers were analyzed. The zipper pull was scanned. But time is an unforgiving keeper of truth. No fingerprints remained. No DNA survived. No trace could say where the bag had been or for how long. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a reminder. A reminder that something had gone terribly wrong. A reminder that the story wasn't finished. A reminder that 4 boys had been swallowed by the hills without a trace. And for Linda Hensley, it was more than evidence. It was a message. "My boy touched this," she said on camera, her voice trembling. "He held it. He carried it. He was out there." For Harold Vickers, the backpack was a confirmation of what he'd always believed. The boys had gone deeper, south, farther than the search ever reached. He brought out his maps again. He circled the same ridges he'd circled for years. He called the sheriff's office, urging them to reopen the case. For a moment they listened. For a moment Ashland dared to hope again. But interest faded as quickly as it rose. Funding dried up, deputies were reassigned, and the case was once again labeled inactive. The backpack returned to storage, sealed in a new evidence bag, this time under stricter conditions. Ashland returned to its uneasy quiet. People moved on, the trail faded further into the brush, and the forest swallowed another year. But something still waited out there, patient, buried and undisturbed. And in 2015, the hills would shift just enough to reveal it. By the summer of 2015, Ashland had grown accustomed to living with unanswered questions. They lingered in the air like humidity, drifting between conversations, softening with time but never disappearing. For many, the story of the 4 boys had become something distant. Tragic, yes, but tucked away like an old scar. But the Woods don't forget, and sometimes those scars don't stay buried. It was a Saturday morning when Daniel Merritt, a weekend hiker from Lexington, headed out toward a ridge west of Ashland. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for mysteries. He just liked forgotten places. Old trails, abandoned routes, anywhere nature had started to reclaim the land. He'd read about something locals called the Limestone Cut, an unmarked section near an overgrown ridge that had once been part of a logging path. Most people avoided it. Too steep, too unstable, too easy to get lost. To Merritt, that meant it was perfect. The morning sun slanted low as he hiked, the air thick with cicadas. He followed a narrow path barely wide enough for a single foot, pushing past ferns and thorny brush until the sound of the highway disappeared behind him. Then he noticed something odd. A pale streak of exposed limestone jutting out from the hillside, like a bone pushing through skin. It looked fresh, like the earth had recently shifted. Curiosity tugged him closer. The slope was loose and uneven. Dirt crumbled under his boots. When he knelt near the exposed rock, he saw something wedged inside a shallow crack. Something metallic, rust curling around its edges. A small tin, wedged tight, buried God knew how long. He almost left it alone. Probably old trash from campers decades past. But something about it, its position, its age, felt strangely deliberate. So he worked it free. The lid crumbled as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of damp paper, was a small notebook, waterlogged and fragile. And tucked behind it, protected just well enough to survive decades of rain and dirt, was a Polaroid photograph. Merritt wiped it gently with the edge of his shirt. For a moment, the image blurred under his thumb. Then it came into focus. 4 boys standing shoulder to shoulder. 4 smiles. 4 shadows on the ground behind them. And above their heads, barely visible but unmistakable, was an old wooden sign. End of trail. He didn't know their names. He didn't know the story. Not yet. But Ashland had waited 28 years for someone to find that tin. Merritt had just pulled the thread that would unravel everything. That night, after posting about the discovery on a hiking forum, someone recognized the photo immediately. A local user commented within minutes. "These are the missing boys from Ashland, the ones from '87. The post spread like wildfire. Within hours, former residents, retired deputies, and people who had grown up hearing the story were sharing the image across social media. And somewhere in Boyd County, a retired deputy saw it too. Harold Vickers stared at the photo on his cracked laptop screen, hands trembling. He didn't need the usernames or the comments. He knew those faces like he knew the lines on his palms. Tommy. Jake. Mark. Ricky. The 4 boys he'd spent half his life searching for. The next morning, police reached out to Merritt. By evening, the ridge was filled with deputies, state investigators, and a forensic team working under floodlights. They roped off the area. They sifted the dirt by hand. They treated the site the way one treats a grave. A notebook that had survived nearly 3 decades of rain, rot, and rock was carefully lifted out of the tin and placed in a protective case. It was warped, fragile. Its pages were fused together. But some of the writing still showed. And on the last partially legible page, written in smudged, shaky pencil, was a message. "We went down the wrong ridge. Mark's hurt. The sun's gone. If you find this, tell our moms we stayed together." It stopped every investigator cold. A forensic tech swallowed hard and whispered, "Oh, God." Because those weren't just notes. They were goodbyes. Within 48 hours, the story consumed Ashland again. TV vans returned. Reporters crowded the sheriff's office entrance. People who had long since moved away drove back into town, drawn by something deeper than curiosity. It felt like 1987 all over again, only heavier. This time, they weren't searching for the boys. They were searching for their remains. The Kentucky State Police launched a full-scale excavation of the hillside. The work was slow, careful, methodical. Brushes, sifters, dental tools, gloved hands moving soil inch by inch. On the fourth day, a forensic anthropologist called out. A bone fragment. Small. Human. Then another. By the end of the week, buried beneath decades of compacted earth and stone, they found 2 partial skeletons. The remains were fragile, weathered, but still identifiable by mitochondrial DNA. The tests came back in late September. One matched the Hensley family. The other matched the Porters. Tommy and Jake had been found. The news hit Ashland like a landslide, swift, crushing, unstoppable. People cried openly in grocery stores. Cars pulled over on the side of Route 60 as their drivers tried to gather themselves. Old deputies who had searched those ridges in '87 sat in stunned silence, staring off into the hills. And Linda Hensley? She didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Because grief doesn't disappear when you find your child, but finally knowing, finally not wondering, gives grief a shape. The excavation expanded, grid by grid, foot by foot. For days they found nothing. Then one afternoon they uncovered a strip of shoe fabric. Later, a tiny rusted buckle from what looked like a child's belt. DNA confirmed it belonged to Ricky Cole. 3 boys were home. Only Mark Dalton remained missing.
Winter was coming. Snow threatened to shut down the ridge, but no one wanted to stop. Not after this. Not after nearly 30 years. At last, ground-penetrating radar picked up a large anomaly deeper in the slope, denser than the soil around it. They began digging. And in early December, they found the final remains. Mark Dalton. All 4 boys were together again. For the first time in decades, the hills of Ashland felt still. No more theories, no more rumors, no more whispered blame. Just truth. Finally.
Once the remains of all 4 boys were recovered, investigators began the painstaking work of understanding what had truly happened in those hills nearly 3 decades earlier. The truth didn't arrive in a single moment. It came together piece by piece, like fragments of a shattered photograph finally reassembled. Inside a conference room at the Kentucky State Police headquarters, detectives laid out everything: the recovered notebook, the Polaroid, the soil samples, the original 1987 search maps, and fresh digital terrain scans. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself understood the magnitude of what they were about to unravel. The first breakthrough was almost embarrassingly simple. The original 1987 trail map was wrong. Not a little wrong, dangerously wrong. The Colton Fire Tower Trail, as printed on official charts at the time, still showed a southern spur leading toward the Daniel Boone National Forest boundary, but that spur had been destroyed years earlier by flooding. The trail no longer existed in reality, but it still existed on paper. And 4 boys had followed the paper. A forensic geographer tapped the printed map with the back of his pen. This, he said quietly, sent them straight into danger. The boys had walked into an area known locally as Holler Bend, a maze of steep ridges, limestone sinks, and unstable rock channels. In 1987, no one had reason to search there, According to the map, no trail led in that direction. It wasn't even considered passable terrain. But the notebook, their own words, proved the boys had gone south, farther than anyone imagined, deep into terrain no one was prepared to search. One page contained a crude sketch of a ridge. Another had compass readings. One had the heartbreaking line, "We can't go back up." Investigators reconstructed the boys' final hours using weather logs, GPS terrain overlays, and erosion patterns on the hillside where the remains were found. The picture that emerged was devastating. On July 23, 1987, the boys likely reached the end of the old Fire Tower Trail around sunset. Instead of turning back, they followed what they believed was a shortcut, a faint path leading south. They weren't being reckless. They weren't running away. They were just trying to get home before dark. But as they descended, the slope grew steeper and the forest thicker. Somewhere along that descent, Mark Dalton was injured. Evidence suggested a broken leg, likely from a fall. The notebook entries around that point grew shakier, more frantic. They tried to climb back up. They couldn't. The ridge walls were too steep. Light faded. Then the storm came. Historical weather data revealed that between June 26th and June 29th, an early season storm had saturated the entire region. By the time the boys entered Hollerbend on July 23rd, the ground beneath them was unstable, primed for a slide. Investigators concluded that the ridge had partially collapsed the same night the boys wrote their final message. That Polaroid, stuck in the tin with the notebook, was likely taken hours before the storm hit. The boys must have heard thunder rumbling through the valley. They must have known they were trapped. They must have felt the weight of the forest pressing down on them. Still, they stayed together. They built a makeshift shelter. They left a message for their families. Ricky, the youngest, might have tried climbing toward the clearing for help. But when the rain hit again, heavy and merciless, the hillside broke loose completely. A wall of rock and dirt came down with terrifying speed, burying their shelter and sealing them beneath a thick layer of debris that hardened over the decades like concrete. No amount of searching in 1987 would have found them, not with excavation equipment that didn't exist in the county back then. They weren't hidden by failure. They were hidden by the earth itself. For days after the final remains were recovered, Ashland felt suspended between heartbreak and relief. People gathered at diners, churches, parking lots, anywhere they could speak softly and share memories of that summer. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't spectacle. It was the town exhaling grief it had carried for nearly 30 years. At the sheriff's office, the final briefing took place in a packed room. Journalists filled every available chair. Families sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly. The lead investigator clicked a projector. Side by side, he displayed two maps: the official 1987 search map and the corrected digital terrain model from 2015. The difference was staggering. Entire sections of the ridge were mislabeled. Elevation lines were wrong. The southern spur appeared intact, even though it had washed out 9 years earlier. The investigator paused, then said softly, "They didn't get lost. We lost them." The room fell silent, a silence that felt like both truth and apology. When the remains were finally released to the families, a joint funeral was held at a small church just outside town. Cars lined the gravel road for nearly half a mile. People who hadn't seen each other in decades embraced like no time had passed at all. Inside the chapel, sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting warm colors across 4 wooden caskets arranged side by side. They were small, too small, and yet too large for the children they once held. Linda Hensley sat closest, her hands folded over a tissue she never used. She didn't shed tears that day,
Not because she didn't feel them, but because she had already cried every one she had to give. What remained was something gentler, something like peace. During the service, Mark's brother, now a grown man with gray in his hair, stepped to the podium. He spoke about loyalty, about childhood, about how 4 boys who never made it out of the woods alive still managed to leave a mark deeper than any adult ever could. He said they were scared, but they stayed together. That matters. That means something. The congregation stood as the caskets were carried out. Outside, a soft misting rain began to fall, the kind that doesn't soak you, but clings to your skin like memory. And as the boys were laid to rest side by side, nearly the entire town stood witness. People who had searched for them as teenagers now stood with their own children, hands resting gently on their shoulders. Harold Vickers stood near the back, hat in hand. He watched as the final shovelfuls of earth were placed and whispered something only the trees could hear. "You're home now." That evening, as the mist settled over Ashland and the hills darkened into silhouettes, the forest felt different. Not healed, not completely, but lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its branches. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the woods weren't keeping a secret. And the story wasn't haunted anymore. It was whole. Autumn settled over Ashland with a gentleness the town hadn't felt in decades. The air grew cooler, the leaves took on shades of copper and ember, and for the first time since 1987, people breathed differently. Less guarded, less tight in the shoulders, less afraid of what the woods might be hiding. Closure doesn't erase grief, but it gives grief a direction, a shape, a place to rest. In the weeks following the boys' funeral, investigators finalized a comprehensive report, a document that laid out every finding, every analysis, every final conclusion. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It was factual and heartbreaking in the same breath. Copies were given to each family. Most of them read it alone, behind closed doors, in the quiet hours of early morning or late night. Some pages were smudged by tears, others were folded at the edges where trembling hands held on too tightly. The truth was painful, but it was theirs now. They didn't have to guess anymore, they didn't have to wonder, they finally knew. Ashland held a memorial gathering downtown in late October. The courthouse lawn, usually filled with vendors and kids playing tag, was covered in rows of folding chairs. A small wooden stage was set up beneath the oak trees. People arrived early, filling the seats and crowding along the sidewalk until the entire block buzzed with low, anxious murmurs. For the first time since the boys disappeared, the town was united not by fear, but by remembrance. As the event began, the wind picked up, rustling the branches above. A state investigator stepped to the microphone, unfolded a small sheet of paper, and began to read aloud from the notebook found in the tin. The boys' words, faint, faded, written in smudged pencil nearly 3 decades earlier, hung in the air like a prayer. "We went down the wrong ridge. Mark's hurt. The sun's gone. If you find this, tell our moms we stayed together." The final line, written at the very bottom, barely visible even after forensic restoration, brought the entire crowd to stillness. "We're scared, but we're not mad. We stayed together." Something broke open in the crowd then. Not sadness, not shock, but release. Parents who had once eyed each other with suspicion now reached across aisles and held hands. People who had blamed themselves, their neighbors, the sheriff's office, the weather, or the forest
finally stopped carrying the weight alone. The truth didn't heal everything, but it stitched something back together. After the reading, the notebook was placed behind glass at the Boyd County Heritage Museum. It rested open on the page containing the boy's final message. On the opposite page were sketches, trees, a crude map, a little shelter made of branches. There were lists, notes to their parents, tiny fragments of childhood preserved by sorrow and soil. Visitors stood in front of it for long stretches of time. They didn't take pictures, they didn't whisper, they just felt. People left flowers, letters, folded paper cranes, toy trucks, matchbox cars, and the small green army men that Linda Hensley used to leave on the ridge every July. A local pastor said, "I've never seen silence speak so loudly." That winter, the old Fire Tower Trail reopened, not as it had been, but with a new name carved into a wooden sign at the entrance, 4 Pines Path, dedicated to those who never stopped searching. The town held a small ceremony on the trailhead. Students from Ashland High placed 4 lanterns along the path, their warm glow flickering through the trees. The lights, they said, represented guidance, a reminder that the boys were never truly alone out there. Some claimed the lanterns could be seen all the way from the ridge. Others said they saw the shadows of 4 figures standing beneath the tree line, shoulder to shoulder. But grief has a way of making shadows look like memories.
Parents finally allowed their kids to hike the trail again, always in groups, always before dusk. The fear that had once gripped Ashland loosened. People didn't avoid the woods anymore. They treated them differently, with respect, with reverence, with the awareness that nature doesn't always bend to human intention. The forest no longer felt cursed. It felt sacred. Life for the families slowly shaped itself around a new kind of normal. Linda Hensley still visited the ridge, but not with desperation, now with quiet reflection. She brought 4 toy soldiers, placed them on a stump near the open clearing, and sat in the grass until the light began to fade. "I don't dream of him calling for help anymore," she told a reporter. "He's not lost now. He's home." Jake's parents moved back into their old routines. His father still kept the boy's bike in the shed, but now he polished it once a year, keeping the rust off like it was tending a piece of history, not a wound. Mark's brother returned to Ashland more often. He hiked 4 Pines Path each time, sometimes stopping at the ridge to whisper a story from childhood, other times leaving nothing at all. Ricky's family found their own healing in distance. His parents lived in different states by then, but each visited the boy's memorial stone whenever they returned to Kentucky. They left a small wooden truck engraved with the name Ricky every Christmas. Healing doesn't look the same for everyone, but it moves forward all the same. As the winter snow began to blanket the ridges, the forest grew quiet again. Not the fearful quiet of 1987, but a calm, settled hush, a winter breath. One evening in December, Harold Vickers returned to the ridge with his old, battered notebook and a small flashlight. He wasn't a deputy anymore. He wasn't investigating anything. He just wanted to stand in the place where the truth finally came to light. He touched the stone placed in honor of the boys. He whispered, "I tried. I never stopped trying." Then he exhaled, a long, weary breath he'd been holding for nearly 3 decades. And for the first time since 1987, he walked away without looking back. Behind him, the forest glowed faintly beneath the moon. 4 lanterns flickered in the distance, casting soft, wandering halos of light along the trail. Some later said the wind that night carried a sound, faint, soft, almost like laughter drifting through the trees. Maybe it was just the forest settling. Maybe it was memory. Or maybe it was something gentler, something long overdue. For Ashland, Kentucky, it didn't matter. The story no longer haunted them. It guided them. It reminded them. It carried them forward. Because when the boys' final message was placed in that glass case, when their remains were laid to rest, when the truth was spoken out loud for the first time, Ashland finally understood something deeper than tragedy. 4 boys walked into the woods in 1987. And through everything that followed, fear, night, injury, storms, confusion, they stayed together. That was their story. And now it was complete.
Winter melted into spring, and with it came the soft return of life to the hills around Ashland. The forest, once a place people feared, now felt like a memorial, living, breathing, always whispering reminders of the boys who had vanished into it and the truth that had finally been brought back out. But the story didn't end with the funerals, or with the maps corrected, or with the museum exhibit. Stories like these never truly end. They echo in the people they shape, in the places they bind together, and in the moments that continue to rise up long after the dust has settled. For Ashland, the echoes were everywhere. In the quiet of the early morning, joggers on Four Pines Path paused at the ridge where the lanterns had burned months earlier. Some left small stones there, smooth river stones with initials, or tiny hand-carved hearts. Others pressed their palms against the memorial plaque and whispered a silent thank you. Teachers at the elementary school dedicated a reading nook to the boys. They called it the Adventure Corner. Its walls were painted with forest scenes, sunlight breaking through branches, winding trails, creeks running between mossy rocks. Kids didn't know the full story, not yet, but they knew it was important, and they treated the space with a kind of reverence children rarely show. At the Boyd County Heritage Museum, attendance tripled. People stood before the notebook as if it were a window into time. They read every line, every sketch, every smeared pencil stroke. The boys' handwriting, young, uneven, hopeful, felt like a voice speaking through decades of silence. One afternoon, a woman visiting from West Virginia placed her hand against the glass and whispered, "My son went missing in '94. I never found him. Thank you for giving these families what I didn't get." The curator cried when she told that story later, because closure isn't just an ending, it's a mercy. Local news stations ran a feature on the case around the 1-year anniversary of the discovery. Not sensationalized, not exploitative, just a quiet, respectful retelling of the investigation, the search, the storm, and the recovery. During the segment, they interviewed Harold Vickers at his home. His hair had grown almost completely white by then. His voice was quieter, softer, the kind of voice that carried the weight of both regret and relief. He sat in his garage, his other office, surrounded by old maps, search logs, and a workbench covered with memories. He told the reporter, "I kept going back because something in my gut wouldn't let it go. But the truth is, I didn't find them. The earth did. And that hiker, he was the one who shifted the story." The reporter asked if he felt peace now. Harold paused a long time, staring down at the topographical map that had consumed half his life. Then he said, "I feel gratitude. That's the closest word. Gratitude that we know. Gratitude that they weren't alone out there. Gratitude that this town never forgot them. That matters. That's a legacy." He didn't look triumphant, just tired, in the way a man looks after finally putting down a burden he's carried too long. The families held a private gathering at the cemetery that summer. No cameras, no reporters, just parents, siblings, cousins, and a handful of close friends. They sat 4 new headstones, simple, matching, polished gray granite.
Under each boy's name were 2 lines. Always remembered. Never alone. Afterward, Linda Hensley stood next to Tommy's headstone with her hand resting gently on the top edge. Her hair had thinned over the years, and the lines around her eyes had deepened. But there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there in decades. A younger cousin asked her, "Do you still go up to the ridge?" Linda smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Not as often. I don't feel like I'm searching anymore. I feel like I'm visiting." Then she added, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, "He knows where I am now." The families lingered long after the sun dipped low, telling stories, some sad, some funny, some too priceless not to be told. Ricky's mom remembered how he used to leave peanut butter crackers in every jacket pocket he owned. Jake's father laughed as he described his son's talent for losing every single glove he ever touched. Mark's brother recalled how the four boys once tried to build a raft out of 2x4s and milk jugs and nearly sank in 3 feet of water. For the first time, laughter blended easily with tears, because these weren't stories of tragedy anymore. They were stories of life. As the years passed, the woods changed too. The old fire tower trail, once swallowed by brush and warning signs, became a peaceful, well-maintained path that families walked on weekends. Kids chased fireflies along its edges in the summer. Couples took engagement photos near the ridge. Veterans hiked the slopes for exercise. And every December, volunteers still lit the 4 lanterns. One for Tommy, one for Jake, one for Mark, one for Ricky. At night, the lanterns glowed like tiny beacons between the trees, soft and steady, as if guiding travelers along a path the boys never got to finish. Some hikers swore they heard faint voices in the distance, light, youthful, drifting through the wind. Not haunting, not eerie, just gentle, like laughter carried from a long way off. Others said they felt a calm settle over them when they reached the ridge, a stillness, almost warm, as though the forest itself was exhaling. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was something entirely else. But Ashland didn't question it. They welcomed it. In a quiet moment late one summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the sky burned orange, a group of local teens stood at the trailhead reading the plaque dedicated to the boys. One girl said, "My mom used to tell me this story. I always thought it was scary." Her friend shook his head. "It's not scary. It's sad, but kind of hopeful, too." "Hopeful?" "Yeah. Look at what they wrote. They weren't angry. They weren't blaming anyone. Even at the end, they stuck together. That's what people talk about now." For a moment, the teens stood in silence, watching the first lantern flicker on as dusk settled. "Guess that's what you call real friends," one of them whispered. They walked the trail together, their footsteps soft, and the lantern light glowing ahead like a promise. Years will continue to pass. Seasons will come and go. New families will move into Ashland, and older generations will fade. But the memory of the boys won't fade with them. It has taken root too deeply, in the hearts of the families, in the spirit of the town, in the soil of the ridge where their last message was found. And every so often, when the wind sweeps down from the hills just right, it carries a familiar whisper through the treetops. Not haunting, not mournful, just a reminder. 4 boys went into the woods. 4 friends who faced fear, darkness, injury, and storms. 4 boys who left behind a message that outlived them. 4 boys who stayed together until the very end. Even now, Ashland doesn't remember them as missing children. It remembers them as brothers, as friends, as a bond stronger than fear, stronger than time, stronger than the forest that tried to swallow their story. A bond captured in one final line, written in shaky pencil on a page that survived storms, landslides, and nearly 30 years underground.
we stayed together. And now, at long last, so did the truth.